Hi there, welcome everyone to CMA Canada's webinar on From Data to Decision. My name is Todd Scaletta. I am CMA Canada's Vice President for Research and Innovation. Before introducing our main speaker and panelist, I just wanted a couple housekeeping duties to take care of. Below your video screen, you'll see an area where you can click on a download to download all the related CMA publications associated with this webinar. As well, you'll able to submit a question by clicking on the Submit a Question button. We'll try to get to your questions today. If not, we'll have a frequently asked questions as part of the archived video. In addition, as part of your registration process, you answered a number of poll questions. We'll be going over those poll questions throughout this webinar. And finally, this webinar will be archived on the CMA Canada research site, www.managementaccounting.org, along with other valuable material in CMA publications. At this point, I'd like to introduce our main speaker. His name is Bernard Marr. He is a leading global authority and best-selling author on organizational performance and business success. In this capacity, he regularly advises leading companies, organizations, and governments around the globe, which makes him an acclaimed and award-winning keynote speaker, researcher, consultant, and teacher. Bernard Marr is acknowledged by the CEO Journal as one of today's leading business brains. Bernard has written a number of seminal books and over 200 high-profile reports and articles on managing and measuring organizational performance as well as enterprise business intelligence. Some of his best-selling books include The Intelligent Company, Key Performance Indicators, More with Less, Managing and Delivering Performance, and Strategic Performance Management. Joining Bernard as a panel member is Jean Kempton, who is the Controller in the Department of Innovation and Advanced Learning for the province of PEI. Jean has over 20 years of experience in both private and public sector, where she brings extensive management, accounting, and strategic leadership. In her role as Controller, Jean acts as a senior representative of the department, providing advice and guidance in relation to financial and strategic matters, as well as is responsible for collaborating with federal and provincial counterparts to foster relationships and develop efficiencies between and within government. Jean has her CMA designation as well as an MBA. She is currently Vice President of CMA PEI and has held various council positions over the past 7 years, as well as being a mentor to many CMA students. Jean shares her knowledge and experience as a sessional accounting instructor at the University of Prince Edward Island School of Business, bringing practical experience to the classroom using an evidence-based approach. At this point, I'd like to turn the session over to Bernard.
Thank you, Todd. Today we're going to talk about how to move from data to decisions. And I want to outline a 5-step model of how we move to more evidence-based management. And what I see a lot is that organizations have a lot of data, but we don't use this data well. We don't necessarily link it to our strategy. We don't really make good decisions based on the data we have. And I think this is the key theme for today. The 5-step model starts really with being very clear about your strategic objectives. Once you have them, you then need to collect data. You need to turn this data into insights. You need to then make sure that these insights get communicated. And then we need to make sure actually better decisions are being made. And in all those, we have lots of traps that we're falling into. And what I see from my own experience working with lots of large blue chip companies as well as mid-sized organizations and government organizations all across the world is that I would argue less than 10% of the data we have in our organizations is really valuable, is used for meaningful decision making. And this correlates really well with some of the other research. It indicates how few strategies are actually executed well. And I think there's a clear link that we're not very clear with our strategies, and therefore we end up collecting lots of stuff. I would argue we collect everything that walks and moves and nothing that matters.
So that finding of 10%, is that across the board of organizations that you've been exposed to?
Probably.
Wow.
There's a in terms of size
Yes.
and sectors, it's interesting that I see lots of large organizations have massive amounts of data.
Right.
While I see lots of small and medium-sized companies who have very little data or believe they have very little data
Right.
or access to data. And then we have government and public sector organizations that are very often forced to collect lots of stuff for reporting to central government organizations. But then again, it is not necessarily linked to their strategy.
Right. Okay. Thanks.
So for me, a really good analogy is moving back a few hundred years to the gold rush in California when the gold prospectors were walking up the mountain, trying their luck with their gold pans, sifting through tons of silt and dirt to find the little piece, the little golden nugget that would hopefully make them some money. And many of them walked up the hill, found very little, sometimes expended all their money, came back bankrupt. And then you get the few that found the little golden nuggets and they are very happy.
Yeah.
Now, winding forward to today's management world, I see very similar behavior, where I see lots of managers having to pan through a lot of dirt and silt in their management reports that is full of detail, full of unnecessary stuff, to every now and then find the little golden nugget that really helps them to make better decisions.
Right.
And I think this is the problem we are facing here, that we need to make sure we don't end up in this scenario. We need to make sure we are very clear about what we need to know, then collect the right data, turn this into insights to make better decisions. So we need more of the golden nuggets and less of the dirt and the silt.
Yeah. And certainly a great analogy, because we always are looking for that key piece of information to base our decisions on. But it's becoming more and more difficult to find that with the reams of information that we are collecting.
Yeah, I agree. I think we've got a number of poll questions. Do you want to?
Yes. So our first poll question is, what percentage of all the data you collect and report in your organization is used to make strategic decisions? And the categories we have are 75 to 100%, 50 to 74%, 25 to 49%, and under 25%. Jean, do you have any initial comments on the survey results?
Well, certainly I think that we collect this information and try to connect it to our strategies in some regards, but certainly from our perspective, when we are collecting information, we collect such a variety of information that it's very hard, back to Bernard's point, of finding that information that is key to take you forward into your strategy and make that connection. So, I think that we think we collect the right information,
Right.
but maybe not necessarily are we doing that in practice.
Interesting.
Yeah, so we're still seeing a lot of organizations that use very little of their data.
Right.
If you look at the results, there's still a big chunk that uses less than 50% of their data.
Yes.
And if you then consider how much it costs to collect all of this, there's a big waste going on. And you end up with a lot of silt. But I
And I guess a lot of noise too, that could be hampering
Absolutely,
good decisions.
yes.
Yeah.
And what I see is that very often we overestimate how much of our data is actually linked to your strategy, because we fail to define our strategy very well. So we think, oh, we would actually like to know this and that, and this is somehow our strategy, and this is our strategy. So we end up collecting lots of stuff
Right.
that we then believe is linked to our strategy and helps us to make better decisions. And again, the other problem is that when I'm a decision maker and I say how much of the data that I get is linked to, is helping me to make strategic decisions, I make this judgment on the data I actually see.
Right.
But then this is off the tip of the iceberg.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of stuff that is collected underneath that might not be on your management report.
Right, so there's some natural bias in,
Yeah.
in some decisions
Yeah.
from what I see.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Well, and a very valid point about the cost of collecting all of this data. It doesn't come easy. Technology today, we can collect lots of information, but we don't necessarily always know why we're collecting this information. And in governments in particular, every piece of information that we can bring in we think is valuable. But yet we never stop and look at the cost of bringing this information in and what are we actually doing with it. So, certainly cost is a big factor here in what we're collecting. And if we could narrow it down and really connect it to our strategy, then we'd probably be much further ahead.
I agree. Yeah, for me, there's a really good analogy of what is evidence-based management, how do we move from data to decisions. And I was doing some work for the Air Force, and I remember I was sitting with the Air Force board, and my very first meeting I was saying to them, one day you need to get me up in a fighter jet.
Yes.
And I asked this question so many times. I think it stemmed from watching Top Gun a few too many times when I was a teenager. So they made it happen. So they invited me to the air base. And my naive belief at this point was you come down, you jump onto a jet, have a great flight, tell everyone about it, and really enjoy it. And my experience was slightly different. I had to turn up the day before for my medical assessment, so they had to make sure I was fit enough to fly. And so they weigh you for the ejection seat settings, and so I was slightly more nervous. And then they tell you it's all going to be safe, but you're also going to be wearing, over your flight overall, you're going to be wearing G trousers. I said, what are G trousers? And they're trousers that when you're experiencing really strong G forces, when the aircraft is going around corners, what this basically means is that when you experience these forces, there's a lot of pressure on your body, which then presses your blood out of your head into your legs, which is not very good because then you pass out.
Yes.
So when this is happening, these trousers will inflate and squeeze your legs and your belly really hard, so the blood can't actually go into your lower body. So again, I was even more nervous. I had a very nervous night, and the next morning I again thought, we just go to the jet now, and I met the pilot, and then again he said there's a really important step. We now need to plan our mission.
Right.
So what we did is we sat down and we mapped out the pathway we were planning to fly. So first of all, what was our mission all about? And our mission was about pretending to destroy this bridge somewhere in the mountains. So we mapped out a path. We would leave the airbase, fly out into the sea, turn around, follow this mountain chain, find this bridge, pretend to bomb this bridge, and then return. What you then do is you print the flight path out and put this in a clear plastic pocket that you have on your flight overall. So when you sit in a plane, you always have the map right in front of you. So what you then do is you take off, and I very quickly realized it was nothing like I expected, because suddenly I was now shooting into the sky. He turned the aircraft upside down. We were now flying upside down into the horizon. So I was looking into the sea, then my trousers started to inflate, and I had my oxygen mask on, and it was all very confusing. And I'm sure they have got bets on how long you last.
Yeah, exactly.
And so what the pilot and I then had a chat, and what you do is you obviously use your dashboard to make sure you actually achieve your mission. And this dashboard is operational performance information, good data that people have spent a lot of time thinking, what data do we actually need? And the pilot told me that they actually learned to fly these aircraft blind, where basically they black out the windows and they just trust the instruments, and the instruments will tell them exactly where they are in relation to where they should be. So here we have a clear strategy, good indicators that help you to execute the strategy, and then at the same time you're always in constant contact with mission control, because I remember halfway through this mission I didn't feel very well, so yes. I said I want to go home, and he said okay, so he shot above the clouds. We went and flying. He said, in control, which was fantastic. So I call them joysticks, but the two things that you.
Yeah. So you're actually flying it?
Yeah. I tell people I was flying it, but it was really they're connected. So whatever I was doing, he still had his hand on.
Okay.
And I'm sure I was doing lots of stuff that I didn't understand. But anyway, whenever I was pulling it up, it was going up. Pushing it down, it was going down.
Yeah.
And he then had to inform mission control that I was now flying. And we then spoke about the role of mission control. And this is basically someone at the base that monitors the airspace around the aircraft to make sure there's no weather conditions you need to be aware of, there's no other aircrafts coming into your airspace, and so on. So this for me is a really good analogy. You now have a good system of operational data and strategic data that helps you to deliver on your strategy. So by the time we then came back, I was completely exhausted. I never realized how physically tiring it is, and that actually we as human beings are the weakest link in all of this. So we landed, I had wobbly knees, I said, I need to go to bed now.
Yeah.
And he then said, no, you have to, there's another really important step we need to complete, which is this after action review.
Right.
So we had to go into a debrief room and talk about it, say, how did this go? What can we learn from this? And most importantly, what can we do better next time? And for me, all those steps are really important. It was really interesting watching some of the high-performing air acrobatics teams doing this, because they have a team of 9. They then come back, and in this debrief, they actually watch a video of what happened. And then they talk about this. How did this go? What was good? What was bad? And then they discuss how they can avoid the bad in the next time and repeat the good. And this, for me, is a really good analogy of what we're talking about here. Being very clear what your data needs and your strategy, collecting this, using this to deliver, and then using it to learn and improve the future.
And so more and more organizations can use this methodology, and certainly the last piece about that review, that looking back, that reflective piece that a lot of times in organizations today, they're too busy.
Absolutely.
And they just move on to the next project. And
Yeah.
it could be a function of all this extra data is causing that busyness as well.
And what I see is that it's all well and good having this reflective piece looking back, but this is all they very often do.
Right.
And therefore it's not very useful. And they don't use this to then look into the future and say,
Right.
what do we actually learn from this? What can we do different?
Exactly.
No, and you're very correct in that regard. I mean, all of us have gone through strategy planning sessions and planning things out. But as we're moving along that strategy, we lose our focus somewhat from the excitement that we had when we're starting out with the strategy. And to your point, I think it is because we're constantly getting these streams of additional information. And you're not focused on, I mean, your analogy is perfect when you think about it, right? You're in a situation where it's critical for you to know what are the key indicators
Exactly.
that you need to be looking at here to both fly the plane, to get you back safe, to keep you alive. I mean, everything connected. But we tend to lose our focus once we get past that initial strategy planning session. And, you know, then you're looking back, what did we do? But again, how do you connect it to the future, and how can we do this better, or how can we change things as we move forward?
Yeah, exactly.
Great.
So moving from this aircraft analogy to
Yeah.
one that is probably even closer to most of our hearts, which is losing weight. And there's some interesting analogies here again, that most of us want to lose a little bit of weight and want to be a little bit fitter, and we don't necessarily always achieve that for lots of different reasons. And there's research that tells us people who join Weight Watchers or other weight loss programs tend to lose more weight, and they tend to keep it off for longer. And you then think, why is that? And you think, what do they do differently? And what they're doing differently is that they're putting a process in place to make this all happen. Because very often we have a vague objective, saying, I'd like to be a bit fitter, I would like to lose a few pounds, but then we're not really serious about it. And I see this in lots of businesses as well. They say, we would like to achieve a bit more market share, make more profit, but then they're not very clear about how we achieve that.
Right.
And what the data is that we then need. So in Weight Watchers' case, they would then define a target, saying you want to lose so many pounds, but they would usually go about your understanding your body mass index, which puts your weight in relation to your height, which then gives you a good target,
Right.
where there's good evidence, again, saying this is where healthy is. And you then get a plan, and you get regular reviews. So you come back every week, and you get weighed. And there's a very honest review. You have to stand in front of everyone on the
Right.
scale, saying, "Here we are. This is how I did."
Yeah.
And very similar, when I was in this position, I wanted to lose a few pounds. I was telling all my friends I'm going to be healthy now, exercising a lot, eating well. And then after a few weeks, they were coming to me saying, "But it's not really happening, is it?" And I said, "No, it's not. Why not?" And I said, "I don't know." And then I was thinking about this and saying, I'm telling companies to be very clear about their strategy and then link the data they need to help them make decisions. And I wasn't doing this. I was thinking, I'd like to lose a few pounds, but I wasn't doing anything about collecting good data.
Right.
And if you think about what Weight Watchers says, this is exactly what they're doing. So I then said, I like gadgets, so I got my apps, and one app helped me to trace what I was eating. So you can even use your barcode scanner on your camera, on your cell phone to scan food items, and it tells you how many calories are in there. So I now had an idea of how many calories I was eating. Lots of the restaurant data is already in there, so if you go to any well-known restaurants, you can then say, I pick meal X, and then it tells you. So suddenly I knew how much I was eating. Now I need to know how much I was burning off. So again, another app now use the sensors in my phone. So when I go for a run, I just press start, I go for a run, and then tracks my run. But not only this, it then also tells me my average speed, and most importantly, how many calories I've burned. So suddenly I had those 2 data points. And surprise, surprise, I was losing the weight because I had good data and I could track it and I could base my decisions. So I remember flying into New York, tired, long day in London, arrived there in the evening, thought I need to treat myself now to a little burger.
Right.
And then I looked at the display and it was telling me then 1,700 calories. It's probably not a good choice when I was trying to not eat more than 1,500 calories at that point. So again, you suddenly have the data to help you make decisions.
Right.
And I think this is exactly what we're talking about here.
But one thing you're saying, you know, certainly you need the data, but it seems very clear that the process that you're going to go through is critically important, that you actually know what that process is.
Exactly. And this is exactly what I want to come to now, that we're how do we now move from data to decisions, and how do we give companies a clear framework and a process? So how do we codify what the Air Force and what Weight Watchers does when they do these things? So for critically important is that we need to start by defining our strategic objectives and information needs. So why are we doing it and what do we need to know? Once we're very clear about this, you can then move to the next stage and say, okay, we now understand what we need to know. How do we now get to the right data? So how do we collect the right information, the right data to help us answer our critical questions, help us to inform our information needs? Once we've done this, we then need to turn this data into insights. We need to analyze the data. And again, what I see a lot is we keep it to the raw data, and we don't really turn this into real insights.
Right.
So we are collecting stuff, but then this is it.
Yes.
And then we report stuff. So we need to collect stuff and then turn this into insights. And once we have those insights, we then need to present the data back to the people that need to make the decisions. And again, what I see a lot is that we're presenting stuff, not insights, in strange format, in accounting, in management accounts that very few people actually understand, that are full of numbers, without actually thinking, how can we actually present this data in a more meaningful way, in a user-friendly way, to really help them to make better decisions? Because if they have to spend half an hour trying to understand what it means, it's not really helping them to make any decisions.
And a lot of times they'll just discount it or won't even bother taking the time to actually use that information.
Exactly. And there's a lot of research, again, if we decide to send our performance data around in little spreadsheets, there is data that says that up to 60% of people really hate spreadsheets, and they won't even open the attachment, let alone getting excited about analyzing it.
Absolutely.
Yeah, sometimes hard to understand if you're not an accountant. But and finally, we then need to make sure we make better decisions. And again, what very often happens is that we, even though we have the data, we don't necessarily make the decisions based on those, on the data. And then there's a really important component of this, which is not really a step in its own right. So we've talked about defining our strategy and information needs, then collecting the right data, analyzing it, reporting it, communicating it, and then making decisions. Along all of this is your IT infrastructure, which usually plays a crucial role. So you need some good systems that help you to collect the data, to analyze the data, turn this into insights, and report on this. So your IT infrastructure and business intelligence and reporting tools are really important, but they're not actually part of the process. So the reason I didn't make it a separate step is that this is supporting the 5-step model. But what I see a lot is organizations jump straight to the reporting and BI tools and say this will give me the answers to all my problems. It won't, unless we have the framework right and we know exactly what we need to know and what data we need and how we want to present it and to whom.
Right, so for your weight losing analogy, the apps that you drew on were to help support these 5 steps. You had the 5 steps,
yeah.
but those apps were able to help
and
you.
I was very clear what I wanted to know.
Enabled you
yeah.
to do it. Yeah.
And the questions I had, it was how many calories do I eat? How many calories do I burn?
Yeah.
These were my key questions.
Right.
Bernard, in your experience, we're collecting all of this information, and you're right. We need to turn it into knowledge if we're going to, support the decisions that are being made. But the people who collect the information, are those the people that need to do the analytics on it to turn that into knowledge? Is that the right place for you to bridge that gap from the information that's collected to those insights? Or do you see it as being a separate function inside most organizations?
I think it's useful to have a separate function. I think what usually happens is that people that collect the data haven't necessarily the skills to then analyze the data. However, what I see a lot is that those people who have some of the skills to analyze it are very much IT focused or very finance focused people who then don't really understand some of the business needs. So there's very often a disconnect of the people that collect the data, the people analyzing the data, and the people that you will use the data. And I think it's really important to bring all of those together. So when we work with companies, what we very often put in place is exactly this function that has the strategic understanding and some of this analytical skills and some of the IT understanding to really bring it all together, to merge our IT, our information management, our analytics function into one that is your corporate intelligence hub that then has a very close link to the leadership team so they can actually sit down and say, this is my question, what data have we got, how can we present this data to help me make better decisions?
Yeah, so you really are talking about putting something in between. And I guess to your point, if it's financial information and you're getting it from accountants, well, accountants will think that there's certain insights or certain knowledge that's really critically important, and it is in their world. But when you bridge that gap up to the leaders and, maybe we're not passing the right information up there and we are missing that gap in between of having someone who can really connect the business intelligence from the information to the knowledge piece.
I agree. And what the other thing is that very often we present financial information, accountants very often assume that the senior leadership team understand what all these numbers mean. My experience is that they don't. And very often they pretend that they do, which is scary.
Right.
So what we need to do is we need to, again, translate some of these indicators that are very common that accountants understand into some practical insights for the senior leaders.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Very good. So now let's look at each of these stages, starting with our first one, defining our strategic information needs. What I forgot to mention is that there's a feedback loop as well from the last step. So once we have made a decision, it then very often feeds back to our information needs and say, okay, now we understand this. It might trigger an activity saying we need to collect more data. We understand this now, so that our information needs will change.
So reflection and then learning, basically.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So this is the arrow at the bottom. But now let's talk about the first one, defining objectives and information needs. So for me, going back to the Air Force analogy, what we want is we want this one-page flight plan that was in my clear plastic pocket on my leg. So, and organizations are now starting to use tools like strategy maps that allow them to very clearly articulate their strategic needs on a single page, saying this is what we want to achieve and this is how we will achieve it. This is basically your flight path for your business. And this is a really good starting point. But then I've done some work with a number of police forces recently, and again what I learned from them is if you are one of those special SWAT teams that go in and try to catch some criminal somewhere. We're not all just taking our guns and running along the street and trying to smash the door in and get them. There's a lot of intelligence going into this first.
Right.
And they sit down and say, what do we actually need to know? So they say, okay, we need to understand the area, we need to understand the escape routes, and who else could be involved, and where could they be. And this is, I think, exactly what I'm saying here, and what organizations need. They need to step back and say, what information do we actually need to help us deliver on our strategy? And a tool that I developed a few years ago is basically starting with a question. It's very similar. It's called Key Performance Questions, and it means that you have to define the question that you want to have an answer to before you start collecting any data.
Right.
And the question basically is a bit like doing good science. When I did my PhD training, one of the first things you learn is how do you do good research. And one of the things you learn is you have to formulate a research question before you collect the data. And what you then do is, you then make sure you collect the right data to help you answer your question. If you start with the data, you very often end up with results that don't really link to your questions. You have proxy data. So companies like Google, for example, do this extremely well now, where their executive chairman, Eric Smith, said, we run our company now by questions.
Right.
And they have designed 30-odd questions. And what they're saying is every bit of management reporting and data that goes to the executive team has to link back to these 30 questions because they are the things we are interested in.
Right.
Yeah.
And this is a really good routine to get into, a really good discipline. But a question is the starting point. The second thing is we still need to make sure we have a decision because I want to know whether our customers like us or not. Is this really helping me to make decisions? So the second stage is then to say, will this help me to make a decision? And a good example is a big retailer collecting a whole load of performance data on what companies or what people are buying, and their belief was if you dump this into a huge data warehouse, you can just use intelligent data mining software to find out all these things. And this is what they did. And one of the things they found out is that men who go shopping on a Friday night very often buy beer and diapers. And you think, why could that be? Is this right? And you think, can I explain this? Probably. Because when are you likely to end up in a supermarket on a Friday night? Probably when you have a young family and you have no social life. And so you can probably explain it, but what do you now do with this information? What decisions are we taking? Do we have a special offer, beer and diapers?
Right.
Probably not. Do we put them next to each other to make it really easy for the man who turn up on a Friday night to go in and buy beer and diapers? Or do we put them in opposite ends? To make sure when they come in, we know they're coming in for beer and diapers. So I put lots of other stuff along the way, lots of snack food, to entice them to buy more. And then you realize, actually, this is now an answer to a question you never had.
Right.
And first of all, you didn't have a question, and secondly, you don't really want to make any decisions on this. Okay. So another big supermarket I'm currently doing a lot of work with, their philosophy was, how can I build the smallest database possible that will give me answers to my most important questions? And I think this is for me the difference, that we are thinking about what do we actually need to know, as opposed to collecting all the silt and dirt.
Well, in as you say that, I think back to one of my students in my accounting course that came forward to me and said to me once, you could stand up there and you could tell us things, but when you ask me a question, you make me think.
Right.
So I think in asking questions, you actually do get people's minds thinking about other things that may come into play as well.
Absolutely, and it comes back to when you report the data as well. Because if you then link it back to a question, questions will always trigger a search mechanism in our brain for answers. Whereas if I give people a list of data and indicators and measures and financial stuff, they are the answers already. Mm-hmm. So you then compare them to targets, and you say tick box, yes, achieved, not achieved, and there's very little questioning going on. And you're absolutely right. You want to make sure that the search for
You're
answers
generating
takes
a
place.
thinking process
Yes.
that's happening there. Yeah.
Good point.
Very good. I think we've got a poll question here.
We do. So our second poll question was regards to, is the performance data in your organizations tightly linked to your strategy? So Jean, some of your thoughts on the results?
Well, I mean, sitting here and listening to Bernard, I think we think it is, but I don't think that that's correct. And I think when we collect all of this information, we're collecting it because we want to link it to our strategy, because we want to move forward. But maybe not necessarily are we good at it, because I think the process is critically important that we follow here, and I think we do too much of collecting information. And we do a bad job of turning that information into knowledge, into insights that we can actually use to base, you know, the decisions on, using that evidence that we're getting from this to make better decisions. I think we do it, but I don't think we do.
Any thoughts?
I agree, and I think even if companies believe that their data is linked to their strategy, a big problem with this is that their strategy is not clear.
Right.
So if they're not clear about their strategic objectives and the questions they want to have an answer to, in their mind they might be linked to a strategy, but it might not be. And only until we have really articulated this, we have written our strategy down, written up our questions, and we're very clear about how we will use them, then we will find out. And in my experience, 60% of data in companies you can get rid of straight away because it's not helping you to answer any critical questions.
Interesting.
Yeah, and that's a lot of noise in the background, right?
Yeah.
When you say figures that high.
Exactly, and this noise clutters up everything, so you end up with this big pan of stuff and dirt and
Yeah.
silt.
The other thing is that, you know, from my experience both in the public and the private sector, no one wants to come forward and say that their strategy isn't clear, right? Whether you're a small independent business or you're a corporation or you're government. Everybody, you know, will come forward and say, no, we're very clear about where we want to go, but maybe not so clear about how they're going to get there.
And by putting it on a map, like a one-page document, you make it very explicit, and you now have something you can share with people. What I see a lot is that strategies might be clear in someone's head,
Right.
who is at the top of the organization, but it never gets filtered down. So the people that are at the bottom of the organization have absolutely no understanding, or they then have their interpretation of what they believe the strategy is.
That's right, and I think, you know, from the strategy mapping, to put something into visual is beneficial throughout the whole organization, right from the top to the bottom. And I think that, you know, we don't do a good job as leaders in the organization of communicating that information down. And if you can put something into, you know, as simple as a one-pager, and that can become what everybody inside the organization sees, then you're not trying to pass loads of communication down to them either. It's now visual to them.
I had one question in regards to the 6% figure that you put out there as far
60,
as
yeah.
60 as far as being able to remove that data. In some cases, we have data that's required for compliance purposes and so forth. So not all of it's going to be strategic per se. I assume that 40% that's remaining would be covering off compliance and strategic aspects.
To some extent, yes.
Okay.
I mean, when we are talking about from data to decisions, a lot of the compliance data actually doesn't lead to any decisions.
It's
So
for strictly reporting.
Yeah. So,
Okay.
but what we do is, what I see a lot is when I work with boards, what they're getting in their information pack is full of these compliance
Exactly,
indicators
yeah.
that they don't need.
Right.
So a first step would be to separate this out, and I actually have an analogy coming on up in a minute. It's like having your car dashboard.
Right.
So your compliance indicators, someone need to measure them, you need to monitor them, and if you miss them, a warning light needs to come up saying, here we have a problem. But you don't want all your compliance indicators on your dashboard,
Yeah.
because
You take financial statements, for example,
Yeah.
right? I mean, they're historical for one thing, right? So that's what's happened in the past. But I mean, you can look at some corporations' financial statements and there's masses of information in there. Is it all valuable? But it's there for compliance purposes. It's there because it's a requirement.
Yeah.
that it's there, but does it all need to be there for decision-making or to turn it into, better knowledge? So I think there's a combination of both.
There's some aspects there of external users using that information for their decisions versus management using information for internal decisions, which is going to go beyond compliance reporting
Exactly.
to more futuristic view.
I agree. So what we need to do is we need to first start with our strategic information needs, saying what are the big decisions we need to make, what do we need to know, what are the big things linked to our strategy. Then, what else do we need to collect and we have no choice about?
Right.
But then we need to separate them out. We still need to collect this, but we don't need to report it.
Okay.
Very good. Now let's talk about the next step. Now we are very clear about what we want to know. We now need to make sure we actually collect the right data. And coming back to the analogy I just mentioned, what we want is we want the clear dashboard that gives us the indicators that we need to drive this car at this point in time. When we know that our car is full of sensors that measure stuff all the time. And we know that if we take our car to the garage, they will plug in a laptop, they will do engine statistics, they will collect lots of detailed information. What I see a lot is that we are putting all this detailed information, like the compliance data, like everything else we are collecting for lots of different reasons, onto the dashboard. And if we do this, our dashboard would look, instead of this very clear visual where we have the clear indicators, would be completely cluttered up where we can't actually see out of the window for all the stuff we have.
Yes.
So what we need to make sure that we move beyond this. And when it comes to indicators, we often make we believe that if we are measuring something, that this will measure the whole thing. And I prefer to use the terminology indicator rather than measure, because things that we are collecting in our organization, the data, will give us an indication of what is happening. They will actually never measure it.
Right.
So the analogy I give here is an indicator or a set of data that we're collecting is like a torch, like a spotlight. So if our aim was to figure out what a completely pitch dark room looks like, so we are now opening the door, we can't see anything. We close the door, the only tool we have is a torch. We switch the torch on, we shine the light into one corner, and in this corner we see a bed. So we then switch the torch off, we leave the room. How confident are we now that we know exactly what this room is? I guess it depends on the bed we saw. If we saw a nice, comfortable bed, it's probably a bedroom, but it could be in a house, it could be in a hotel, but it could also be a bed showroom. Mm-hmm. Or could be a kitchen with a bed in it for no particular reason. So what we now have is we have a bit of data, but it will never be able, what we all want to do is go in and switch on the light and say, what is it?
Right.
When it comes to collecting data for anything in our organizations, we will never, ever be able to switch on the light. And this is really important to understand. So very often we make this assumption, if we deliver on this KPI, we've delivered good performance.
Right.
And especially when we then link this to incentive systems. So if you buy into the spotlight analogy, which I hope you do, then it's a bit like telling your kids to tidy up their room. And you're saying, but I'm only checking this corner here. And if this corner is really clean, you're going to get a treat.
Right.
We all know what's going to happen. This corner will be absolutely clean.
They're going to clean the corner.
And everything will be rammed under the bed into the cupboards.
Exactly.
So, and this is a bit like linking your incentive system too closely to some of the indicators you're collecting. Right. So the point I'm trying to make is indicators are just that, indicators. The other problem that we are facing is that we face this dilemma here, that on the one hand side we need numbers, and there's a quote by a philosopher 3,500 years ago saying, without numbers we understand nothing and we know nothing.
Right.
That's all great and right. So if you're in the desert and you walk into the desert and you have no idea, no navigation, you don't know where you are, you're completely lost.
Right.
So we need information, data, numbers. At the same time, there are some things we all know are very important, but they're much harder to measure. So if I walk into the desert and I have my compass, I know exactly where I am. If you want to measure things like love in our lives, we all know that matter a lot, but we can't actually measure them very easily, put them into numbers. So this dilemma, and a really good quote by Albert Einstein saying that not everything that counts can be counted,
Right.
and not everything that can be counted counts.
Counts, yeah.
So this is really important that we get this balance right, that when we collect information and data in our companies, that we look at both sides a little bit. So a good example for me is measuring customer satisfaction. So organizations want to understand how my customers how do they perceive me. So in the past, we looked at sending out a survey, asking lots of questions, because we don't really know what questions to ask. We use a standard survey that everyone else is using.
Smile survey.
Yeah. And so when it comes to customer satisfaction surveys, employee satisfaction surveys, what I see a lot is that this data is not useful because people haven't really thought about the questions they want to have an answer to, and then they haven't really thought about how best to collect this in a meaningful way.
Right.
So a number of companies that I work with at the moment, they have moved from the standard set of questions, sometimes 3 pages long, which in fact is quite arrogant if you think about this, when they're saying, I know what you want, Todd, you're my customer, and here I'm asking you, have I given you what I think you want? Can you please answer the questions?
Over the next 15 minutes.
Yeah, exactly, yeah, or 3 hours sometimes. And then you think, actually, what I would like to tell them is not on here. So some of the companies I've recently worked with, they got rid of this survey and replaced it with one single question, the Net Promoter Score, which is one of the indicators I talk about in my book, Key Performance Indicators, which says what are some of the really good indicators companies can look at. And the Net Promoter Score, for example, asks, how likely are you to recommend us to a friend? And then on a scale from 1 to 10, very unlikely to very likely, you then score. The beauty of this is you now have a number. The number is comparable to all other companies in your sector and outside, so you get a really good benchmark, which usually doesn't happen in your homegrown customer survey, because you end up saying customer satisfaction has gone up from 75 to 78. Is that good? Is this bad? You don't know.
Yeah.
So now you have a number that is more relevant, but you still only have a number. So what most of these companies now do is they add a question saying, what do you really like about us? And what do you think we could do better? And now you have a number, but you're also you're capturing some of the softer elements that we very often miss.
Right.
And especially as accountants, we tend to prefer numbers as opposed to actually asking questions, because what can they say? How can I analyze this? But there are now tools out there that will allow us to analyze and make sense out of these written feedbacks.
No, Enterprise Rent-A-Car uses the Net Promoter
Exactly,
system,
yeah.
and it actually has tied it to performance measurements
Exactly.
and rewards within their organization.
And they are a very good example. They move from a very complex survey to something that's very simple, and they just look at tiny bits of their data, and they realize that if you rent a car and you say you're happy, that there's very little relationship between you being happy and customer loyalty.
Right.
And if you think about this, if you rent a car, you expect to be happy. But there was a big link between people that said they were very happy and customer
Yes,
loyalty.
that's right.
Because then they have exceeded my expectations, therefore I will become a loyal customer.
Yeah.
So again, back to understanding what they wanted to know, they now measure exactly this, how many customers are very satisfied.
So is some of it really just simplifying where we're going with asking all these questions, with trying to find out all this information, with really taking a step back and saying,
Exactly.
what do we really need to know here? Because we're down here and now we've got all this information. It sounds like a little bit of it is just simplifying what's important
And better
Completely.
questions.
Yeah.
and
So-
better questions.
So less is more, but also
Completely.
better is important.
Yeah, exactly. So be very clear what your strategy, your questions you want to have an answer to, the decisions you want to make, and the data you will get. And what I see a lot, we start with the data.
Yeah.
Customers are important to us, so we better survey them.
Right.
We know employees matter, so we do an employee satisfaction survey. And
Well,
we
and
then do this.
sometimes, when you say that, we start with the data. Sometimes I think what the questions are is a hard thing to come up with. I think back to when I did my thesis paper, and when I started out, I wanted to know this, but I really had to, pull that string and say, what is the main question I need
Exactly.
answered here? So I think it's difficult
work.
to get there.
Yeah.
It's work.
It's
It's
work.
it's
It
work
is.
getting back there. Yeah,
But it's value. So.
that's right. Yeah.
And what is important is that we involve the executives in identifying those questions. What I see a lot is that executives get very excited about defining their strategy. When you then start talking about indicators, they lose interest
Right.
for whatever reason. So what is important is that you continue to engage them, and by defining the questions, you continue to engage them. They understand the links much better.
But do you think they're losing interest because they really don't know how to put those indicators
Yeah.
in place?
Yeah. Yeah. And very often that it then gets cascaded to the next level down, saying you find the indicators.
Right.
This is what we want to know. You find them, because they don't know how to find them. They end up using generic surveys and
Yeah.
things like that.
Creating disconnects along the way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And this is even made more complicated now, because in the past we had lots of data, lots
Right.
of things we could possibly measure: our finance data, our customer data, our employee data, our quality data. Now, the world of social media, the world of the internet allows us to access different types of data, what people call big data. And big data is different because we now have, with the new recent technology evolutions, we now have an ability to access data that is so big in volume and so fast moving and so unstructured that in the past we had never access to. So if you say, I want to understand what people are saying about my company, you do a survey. But we also know that if you're a big company, that there are millions of people on Facebook and Twitter and other social media sites are talking about your company all the time. So wouldn't it be great if you could actually understand what they're saying? Now you can, because these tools are there. They're big data analytics tool that allow us to understand what are people saying and what's the sentiment of this. So they're using tools like they're analyzing the language we're using to then understand, are they talking about our brand positively or negatively. And if you just think about all this amount of data that's generated in all our smartphones, in all our internet visits, in our browsing history, and all of this now we can access. And what is interesting is that we can access this without actually spending a lot of money and without having a lot of IT resources. So in the past, people, especially in smaller businesses, though, this is something for the big guys. They have the big IT systems and the big
Right.
budgets. There are tools out there, lots of them. I think in the management accounting guidelines, I mentioned some of those that are now available for free that you can use.
Right.
So a tool like Social Mention is something you can use that allows you to do this sentiment analysis. So what are people saying about my company, my brand name, and so on. And any company can use this for free. There are lots of Google tools that are out there, Google Analytics tools, Google Trending tools that companies now can use. So if I'm a small company, I would be crazy not to tap into this, because it will give me big advantage. If I can understand, and in the past only big budget companies could do this. They could hire a big market research company saying how are trends shifting.
Right.
Now you can use Google Trends for free to understand what people are searching for and how this is shifting all
Right.
over all the time. So you can define your keywords, you can see how these keywords are changing, what related key terms, search terms people are using to really get an insight. And I think we've got a two poll questions in regard to big data.
Yes, we do. So this is our last poll question. And do you think big data and analytics will be important for your company? Either yes or no. And do you currently collect and use big data analytics? So, Jean, some of your thoughts on the results from this poll?
Well, I think certainly that it will be important. It is important. And, you talk about doing surveys, which, depending on when you give a survey to someone. So today I might answer it one way. Tomorrow, if you were to give me the same survey, I might, have different answers depending on where I'm at, what I'm thinking about. But I think a lot of this, with social media, where people will actually comment on great experiences. It's voluntary. I'm going on a site or I'm going on Twitter and I'm saying, you know, had a great experience here or had a bad experience here. So I'm doing this voluntarily. Not that they don't do surveys that way, but I think emotions are built more in. Now, when I say emotions, if I have a great experience, I want to tell everybody. I want to go post it on my Facebook or, you know, I want to tweet that this is the experience that I had, and same with a bad experience. So I think companies need to take notice because, to me, this is the honesty coming out. You know, it's real time. It's me going forward and saying, this was my experience with this company, good or bad. And I think they do need to pay attention to it.
And you're so right, because when we complete a survey, in our minds we suddenly think, okay, I'm answering a survey, so what do they want to know? What
Right.
do
Right.
if they're asking me, are we too expensive? I'm thinking, I'd like to pay a bit less, so I better tell them they're expensive.
Right.
So there's lots of thinking going on, whereas if you just capture some of the natural conversations, you get the real insights.
I think the other aspect there, Gene, is that now I'm in control of the situation, and so I can put information up as that has occurred. The survey might come to me at a different time, and that
Right.
survey might come a day later after my stay, or might come a week later after my stay. It may be coming to me during a busy point, so I'm just going to put it in junk mail. There's lots of factors that would influence
Certainly.
my results, as you indicated, versus when I'm in control of it, I'm putting in those honest thoughts as I feel at that time. So.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I really think that people, you know, with social media, they think they can say whatever they want, and in most cases they do.
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
Good, bad, or
Yes,
otherwise.
yes.
Absolutely.
But, you know, again, there's that honesty
Yeah.
that you're really getting from that forum.
And you're now seeing what they're telling all their friends.
That's right.
Yeah,
Yes,
exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
For all eternity. So I see this as a trend for sure, and again, the data seems to show that not many organizations are actually doing it, but certainly this is something that we will see more in the future.
Absolutely, it's on their radar.
It's on the radar. CMA Magazine has written a few articles on this topic as well, so certainly an emerging trend for us to be cognizant of.
And I think in some of the articles I've recently written on big data, a big word of caution is that the trap is even bigger. To think, now I have access to all this stuff,
Right.
Yeah.
let's access all this stuff. And it's even
Goes
more
back to your
critical
gold
to
pan
go back
analogy.
and exactly to be very specific about the questions and the decisions that this data will actually help you to make.
Yeah.
And if there's no question and no decisions, don't bother.
But the big aspect, the big bang, is that you have just all those, you have all
Absolutely.
that extra data to
Yeah.
draw on. So, but you still need the discipline at the front end
Absolutely.
to ask the right questions. But the big bonus is that I can draw on all
Completely.
this data, this huge amount of data. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you're very correct. I mean, you're trying to find that nugget, and here we are coming around the corner with more information for you to have to sift through
Yeah,
now,
that's right.
right? And a lot of information. So, interesting.
Very good. Let's move to the next step, which is then we need to turn the data we now have collected into insight, into analysis. And for me, there are two big trends at the moment in data analytics. And the two trends for me are testing your business model. So if you have a strategy map and you believe that happier customers make you more money because they're loyal, it's worth testing this. So what Enterprise found out by testing exactly this relationship is actually it wasn't the case. In the past, they believed that everyone who's happy and very happy is loyal. They then tested this and said, is this actually the case? Over time, they realized no. So you can learn from this.
Right.
And the other big trend at the moment is experiments, experimental
Excellent.
design. So when it comes to evidence-based decision-making, moving from data to decisions, what you do is you almost set it up like an experiment. You make sure that you collect data to help you answer a question, and you collect it in a way that's a bit more scientific. So you, a bit like a drug trial. So if a drug company comes up with a new pill, it says,
Yes.
this will sort you out.
Yeah.
If you then take it, there's a problem, because how can they trust the data? Because we know that there's a psychological effect. So
Right.
if I take a new drug, I feel better
Right.
because I think it's helping.
Yeah.
So it's called the placebo effect. So
Exactly. Yeah.
So what they do in order to control for this is they will give two of you the drug. One of you will get a placebo, so a tablet with no active ingredient in it, and you will get the wonder drug, but you don't know which one you are.
Right.
And then I compare the results, and then I get real insights. So this is, for me, we need to think more about having a control group. So there's a good example from websites. Companies like Yahoo, for example, very content-driven website. If you type in yahoo.com, you think, I always believe, that you just go to the same website. That's not the case, because what they have is they have experimental websites. So if someone came along and said, okay, if you have an ad that is in red in the top right-hand corner of the screen that is flashing, that will make people click on it, because this is what they want. They want you to click on it. They could just take the research saying, okay, it is working, put it on, and then they track the data. But they still don't know, was this because there was just a big news item on this and this is why they're now clicking on it, or is it because it is red and flashing? And because the research only looked at red, we don't know if I make it blue, maybe even more people click on it.
Right.
So what they're doing is they will take a percentage of us and take us to this experimental site where they have this red flashing ad. And they compare this with their real website.
Right.
And once more people are clicking on it, they then switch over and make this a real website. But then they continue to experiment with what pulse is this flashing, what colors, what's the headline that really works. Something newspapers would love to do. They have to sit in the middle of the night, come up with a headline and hope for the best.
Right.
They can change the headline all day long. And they look at real evidence before they then make a decision to switch over. And this, for me, is a very simple example of really good evidence-based management and experimental design. What I see a lot in companies is we make a decision and then we collect the data to justify our decisions.
Yeah.
As opposed to, this is the question I have, now let's collect some data that then informs our decision making.
Right. And one of the challenges, and we've certainly faced it, I agree 100% that the decisions you will make when they're based on evidence will be better, more sustainable decisions. But one of the challenges is that it takes time. Right? When you put something new into place and you have to wait to see what the results are from that, waiting for that evidence sometimes because everybody wants the answer now. Right? So it's a challenge. It's a bit of a cultural switch, if you will, that we almost have to educate people that in the long run we can make better decisions doing this, but you can't have the information now.
It is a bit of a cultural shift.
Certainly.
And you don't need to be a big company like Yahoo or Google or someone else to do this. I recently did some work with a restaurant chain, very small chain in Europe, and they just have established this culture of experiments, of evidence-based decision-making, and they do this in everything they do. So when they design a new menu, and they do this in every season, they then invite regular customers in. So we put the menu together, this is the pricing. They give regular customers the meals and then say, how much would you pay for this?
Yeah.
And this is so clever because they get a real insight of how people will in the future perceive value for money.
Right.
Right.
Because they think, I would pay $10 for this,
Yeah.
then price it around this because people will always think this is good.
And by drawing on those regular customers, those customers know the restaurant, know comparatives to previous meals that they've experienced there as well, to kind of understand the value prop within that organization.
Exactly, and lots of things. They then also said, okay, there's lots of data out there that I can use. And restaurants is one of the industries where they're going bust all the time because people don't do this. Very similar to other small and medium-sized companies. So in what this company did is they also looked at research and they found that if someone takes you for a business lunch, you're very likely to order the second most expensive item on the menu.
Right.
Because now someone else is paying.
Yes.
You might as well go and treat yourself. But picking the most expensive one would seem too greedy.
Right.
And the same applies to wine and others. So what they can now do is they can make sure that the biggest profit margin is on the second most expensive item.
Yeah.
So just using good data to actually inform their thinking.
Right. Interesting.
Very good. Let's talk about the next stage in the model then. This is about how do we present data and communicate this. And we talked about Excel and spreadsheets earlier on, that this is usually the way we present data, or in lists of indicators. So what I see a lot is that we get these types of KPI dashboards where we say this is all our data, and here's our comparison to last year, and here's our trend. Well, what this is basically giving you answers to lots of questions you probably didn't have.
Right.
And what I see a lot, and what that is then happening in boardrooms, is that people get the data and then try to make sense out of this. And then you end up with lots of detailed discussions where they delve into the minutest level of detail.
Yes.
And this is really what you want to pull them away from.
Right.
And what I'm arguing for is that actually all this detail you don't need to see. We need to translate this detail into something that is more meaningful. And I believe we can learn something from newspapers, because what newspapers do is they take a lot of information, a lot of data, they analyze this, they interpret this, and then they turn this into a front page. And this front page, first of all, has a headline saying this is what happened. And then they will give us a picture that puts this into context.
Right.
And then they will give us a short narrative at the bottom saying these are the key facts. And they will point us to page 8, where we get then the in-depth interview, the data charts if we need them.
Right.
What we do in our organizations is we just give people page 8
Right.
and lots of them.
Right.
And we don't think, what is the headline? How can I produce a meaningful picture, a graph that visualizes performance? Again, if we give people a list of numbers, we can't really see trends. So if we give people a good graph that then shows trends, comparisons, so we want a headline, this is what happened, a good picture, and then a written narrative. So people can start talking about the stories. I mean, storytelling is the way we've shared knowledge for the last since we
Beginning of time.
Exactly. So, and for me, it's important to relegate data actually to an appendix. So I work with a company that we had to wean off this. They had a 100-page report. So over time, we said, okay, let's introduce little cover sheets in each of the sections. After a while, then we moved all the cover sheets to the front and had all the detailed data as an appendix. And over time, people started to trust the summaries. And then again, after a few months, we moved the appendix to a shared drive, and they are now happy with a 9-page, very visual report.
Perfect.
Again, when you think of it in the context of the newspaper, from the article to the picture, you're catching their attention, right? That's what makes you buy the paper, is because you caught that, that caption at the front. And in essence, what we're doing is doing it backwards.
Yeah.
We're giving them all the information
Exactly.
and not getting to
Exactly.
what was the main
big
point,
story.
the big story, the big picture. Yeah.
And the reason why we're not doing it, because it, again, is work. So I actually need someone high up in the organization to interpret this, to come
Right.
up with the headline, and this is often not taking place.
Right. Again, back to that, bridging the gap of the two and having that unit in between that can actually do that analytics that breaks it down and puts it into a piece of knowledge.
Absolutely. So when it comes to the picture, in a newspaper, obviously we have nice photographers that come up with really good pictures. Translating this into our companies, we need good graphs. And what I see a lot is producing something like this, an Excel graph where I just typed in my data points and say, give me a bar graph. So this bar graph, if you look at it, is actually really hard to read, because if you look at some of the data communication principles, I now look at this graph, and first of all I need to understand which color corresponds to which
Right.
region. So I go up and down, up and down. Then what I really want to understand is which region is the highest and the lowest. So I want to order them. What I now do is in my brain I order them, and I lose
Right.
I lose track of what I'm doing. So in the end, it's giving me a real headache. So by following some very simple principles, turning this into a graph like this, first of all, if you use different colors, which this spreadsheet graph has automatically decided to do, it means that my brain thinks they're all different things.
Right.
So using the same color helps. Ordering things in order of size helps, because I now can read it better. Turning it from vertical into horizontal, again, helps because I have a longer
Right.
space to actually put the label next to it. And suddenly you have, and you take out some of the additional clutter like grid lines, which you don't really need.
Right.
And you have something that people can actually read and interpret. And we recently put a course together on how do people communicate data better. And they are just some of the principles here. So another example is a bar graph. Here, what I've done is I just plotted my actual performance versus my budgeted performance, because I just put it into graph. Here, my numbers give me a give me a line graph. Again, how will people use this information? And what we need to do is we need to step back and say, okay, the person that is receiving this information, what decisions do they want to make, and therefore what information do they need? So what I'm interested here is what is the gap? What's the variance between budget and actual? So again, in my brain, I need to do a lot of work here.
Right.
Compare all these different gaps, as opposed to just giving people what they need, which is the difference, the variance.
Mhm.
And the same for pie charts, which are completely overused. There's lots of research that shows if we have more than 4 or 5 slices of a pie, our brain can't actually compare the sizes of them very well.
Yeah.
So this might look a bit sexy. Say, oh, we've got a great graph here. We've got our new dashboarding software that gives us all these 3D great graphs. The problem with this is now, again, we can't actually read it because you go flip forwards and backwards trying to link the colors to the pie chart. Then it's very hard to actually compare. And then we make it extra hard by making it 3D.
Right.
Yeah. But again, what you're doing in the other examples is simplifying.
Exactly.
Right? You're simplifying the information, and I think we do tend to overcomplicate and make things overcomplex.
Yeah, I agree. And again, the same example, this chart probably presented in something like this is so much easier to read and understand. And the final step in all of this is then that we need to make better decisions. And this comes back to my first analogies of the fighter jet, where you have your after-action review, where you then look at the data and you learn from this. And the analogy I use here is, if we think about schools in our country, and you think, why do we have schools? Why do we send our kids to school?
To learn,
Yes.
get a good job, and support me when I'm old.
Very good. So how do we then assess whether they have learned and will get a good job and hopefully support you when you're old?
Boy, we get report cards, we get
Exactly.
feedback from the teachers. In my case, the principal's usually phoning about the kids. So.
So what we tend to do is, in schools and universities, we teach something for a period of time. At the end of the time, we have an exam of some sort. And if you think, what sort of behaviors does this drive in kids?
Learn what's on the test.
Exactly. So what you try to figure out what's going to be on the test, and you learn that. And now this is all made worse by assessing teachers on the same exam
Sure.
progress in kids. So there's now a real incentive of teachers to train their kids to pass exams, as opposed to what a good teacher should be doing is to inspire them to learn and improve.
Right.
So there's a big debate in education. How can we turn this around instead of having this backwards looking view? Because if you get a result that you don't like, you're not going to dig out your old books and say, I better close my knowledge gap. You're saying, well, think about the next exam.
Yeah.
The same for the teacher. So the role of the teacher should be to inspire you and motivate you to learn. And how can we do this? By having more formative assessment. So there's a role of the teacher to continuously assess progress in kids with an emphasis on identifying gaps and closing those gaps.
Mhm.
So what you want as a teacher is you want to continuously assess progress and then say, okay, I think they don't understand this. How can I make sure they do? And then you motivate and inspire them to learn. So this formative assessment that is taking place all the time is looking at the future and doing something better. While this, what we call summative assessment, this test at the end, is completely backwards looking.
Right.
And there's nothing that will help you with the future. And this is exactly what we're getting wrong in our companies, where very often we review performance, and just the word review means we're actually looking into the
backwards.
past
Right.
as opposed to the future. So one of the things we do in organizations is that we put in place performance improvement meeting. Just by changing the name from the past to the future, you change the emphasis on improvement and on and onto learning.
Mhm.
And then again, companies that I mentioned that we're working with, big blue chip companies, are now doing this. They are using these performance improvement meetings, and they're using the questions as the key agenda items. And then they almost act like a courtroom where the board sits like they're like the jury. They know which question is on trial here, and then they bring the business analysts in. And because they now have good reporting, they had all the summary sheet, they know what's happening, but they can then question the business analyst almost like an expert witness, saying, where's the data coming from, how reliable is it, what is your interpretation of it, and then they cross-examine this expert witness, and then they make a decision. And again, this is not happening. What I see is a lot of people getting bored by one slide of numbers after the other after the other. You see eyes glazing over. Or the other one I see is where you have to come in and justify your existence. So you get lots of finger pointing and defensive reasoning.
But there's that whole field of behavioral economics that has emerged, saying that rational individuals or rational organizations are not always making rational decisions, and some of the causes or tendencies have been the sunk cost effect, or loss aversion, or risk aversion, or anchoring and anchoring numbers. How does that impact this? So where we see this tendencies of people making irrational decisions still, so what's some of the impact? And how does this model potentially help that?
What you want is you want the best data to inform your decision making. There's a lot of evidence that shows if you have the right data, you make better decisions. So what we want to avoid is people making stupid decisions for the wrong reasons. But sometimes also a friend of mine, an accountant, wanted to buy a new car, and he gave me the spreadsheet. He couldn't quite decide which car to buy, so he being an accountant, he created a big spreadsheet with all the criteria that were important to him, and then he scored all the different cars. So he scored them fuel economy and performance and comfort, and he test drove all of them, and he had a little score sheet, got quite excited about it. And then it all went quiet, and he came along with his new car. So that's all great. So what happened to your score sheet? So didn't really want to talk about it. What happened was he didn't buy the car that scored the highest, because he realized that actually he got his model wrong. It was all about the brand in the end. Even though the car wasn't the best on fuel, it wasn't the best performing car, but he wanted this particular brand.
Right.
So we make those decisions quite often because we don't understand what we're looking for.
Right.
Does this make sense?
Yeah, and so those would have been some of the key upfront questions he would have been asking.
Yeah.
In step one of the model.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But really, he wasn't looking at what was important
Exactly.
to him.
Right.
At the
No,
end of
he
it.
was excited about collecting all these things.
Right.
That he thought would be the key criteria to buy a car.
But they weren't.
No.
So how much emotion, like that to me is a little bit of bringing emotion in again to your decision making. And certainly we do it from a personal perspective. And do you think that too much of this is creeping into the business world where, both myths and biases and emotion is coming into play in some of the decisions being made?
Yes, and a little bit of this you want. So coming back to the spotlight analogy, I think we can collect any amount of data. We will only ever have a spotlight. So there's always the need to have my professional judgment and my experience that comes into the decision making. So otherwise we could just all be machines. They can make decisions for us. But we can't, because we still need the interpretation of all of this. But what we want is the right data points that then help us to make those decisions.
Right, and I guess in making any decision, it's never one sole piece of information. It's looking at the context, whether it's local context, your stakeholders, your experiences, your judgments,
Absolutely.
and then looking to the evidence as well.
Yeah. And some of the companies I'm currently working with, they take this note very seriously, where they create little cross-functional teams who then actually, when you have traffic lights, they put the traffic lights against the question, saying, are we red, amber, or green? And then they look at all the data they have, and then they discuss this and say, based on all this data, in my judgment and experience, this is the color code I'm giving it, as opposed to having everything automated.
Interesting.
Very good. So let's summarize what we've been talking about. First, decision making is everyone's everyday job. And this is so important. We make decisions all the time. What we want is we want to make them as good as we can. So how do we do this? First, we need intelligent strategies. So by defining our strategy map and our strategic objectives very clearly, we have a good starting point. This then means we will design more intelligent data. So once we have our strategic objectives, we can then design our questions we want to have an answer to and the decisions, which then lead to better data and better KPIs. Once we have this and the right data, we then need to analyze this, turn this into insights using experiments, using this to test our business model. Once we've done this, we then need to communicate this, and here we need to get the balance right between the numbers, really relegating the numbers, and focusing on visuals and narratives, on stories and pictures to communicate. And then we need to make intelligent decisions, really improving the way performance is reviewed, changing the emphasis from the past to the future, and on reviewing the past to actually improving the future and learning. And all of this will then help you to embrace this culture of an evidence-based based management.
Terrific. Well, thanks, Bernard. We have time for just a few questions from the audience. Hopefully, I'm not sure if you'll be able to answer this one or not, but how long does it typically take to implement the model that you've outlined? And I might also draw on Jean as you went through this with the public sector, but with the organizations you've done this, and I'm sure it would be a fairly wide range. But
yeah, complete range from very small to very large, from public to private, and how long it takes depends a little bit of where you're starting.
Oh,
so if you are already, if you have a culture where people want good data, they have some of the reporting infrastructure in place, they have good data, it's straightforward. Sometimes if they have nothing, again, this can be quite easy. If they, very often small, medium-sized companies have very little data. They only have a bit of financial data if they're lucky. So again, you can put these things in place very quickly, saying, okay, what do you need to know? What's your strategy? Let's connect these points, collect the right data, and they're up and running very quickly.
So are we talking 3 months, 6 months, or?
3 months, absolutely.
Okay. And so on your side, Jean?
Well, certainly in the public sector, it's taking us a little longer, but I mean, we've probably been, and again, you're absolutely correct that it depends on where you're starting from. And we really got involved in this because of the devolution of a program from the federal government over to the province of Prince Edward Island. And we had basically nothing to start with. So that's where we were starting from, right? The programs, we would develop them as we went along, so we took it over from the federal government and then had to customize it to Prince Edward Island, so it takes a little bit longer. But we're 3 years into this now, and certainly what I'm noticing is that the culture is changing. I mean, Prince Edward Island is a small province, but unlike, I mean, every government across Canada, across the world, is struggling right now with resources. They're scarce and they're very valuable. So decision-making has got to be based on the best, most sustainable information that we can have moving forward if we're going to have a future for our kids down the road. So I think culturally, this is perfect timing, what's going on across the country, what's going on across the world, for people to be trying to base their decisions on the best evidence that you possibly can. And it's not evidence alone, like I said before. It's based on your stakeholders. It's based on your local context. It's based on your experiences and your judgments and so on. So it's an all-encompassing to me. But I think we have to. I think it's unbelievable that it's 2012 and we're talking about basing our decisions on evidence. We should have always been doing this. And you look back to medicine, who has probably done the best job of all of the professions in really implementing this across. And And management really needs to start looking to the evidence, what research has already been carried out, and using that as a key point when we make decisions. So,
absolutely, it's much more of a gradual evolution. So actually, when you say how long does it take to put this in
Absolutely.
place, it's probably you're never there,
right.
but you have to start somewhere.
Right.
So start by defining your strategy, get one step closer, and all of this will hopefully improve as you go along.
Terrific. One last question, and we'll try to be succinct as possible, is what's the biggest challenge to implement this type of system? Or what are maybe the key enablers, I suppose?
There are quite a few, but if I had to pick one, is the senior level buy-in.
Okay.
If I work for an organization and the senior leadership team, the CEO, don't believe in fact-based decisions, it will not work. So for me, it always starts from the top and filters through into the organization, which then creates this culture. So for me, the biggest challenge is culturally changing this over time. At the same time, when you talk about changing culture, companies come to me and say, can you help us put this in place? Our culture is really not like this.
Right.
Then you can't just say, no, you can't do it. So by putting some of these processes in place, you will over time change the culture.
Right. Okay.
But if they don't believe in it, it will not work.
Will never work. I'd like to thank Bernard and Jean for taking the time to be with us today on this webinar. It will be archived on www.managementaccounting.org. As well, again, there's a wealth of information on that website as far as publications, including Bernard's publications on From Data to Decision, his management accounting guidelines, and so forth. Thank you, and we'll see you at the next webinar.